Grandpa's late-night creature double feature never looked quite this strange. We're digging up 8 forgotten monster movies from the 1970s, films that once haunted drive-ins and TV reruns before vanishing into obscurity. Stick around, because the last one on this list is a studio-backed nightmare almost nobody remembers exists. The Legend of Boggy Creek, 1972. Somewhere in the swamps of Fuke, Arkansas, local legend claimed a hulking ape-like creature had been stalking the backwoods for decades, and in 1972, a small-town filmmaker decided the story deserved the big screen treatment. The Legend of Boggy Creek blended documentary-style narration with dramatized reenactments of supposed encounters, presenting itself less as a traditional horror movie and more as a folksy, matter-of-fact investigation into a monster the locals swore was real. That docudrama approach is exactly what made it such an unlikely phenomenon. Shot on a shoestring budget with local non-actors playing themselves, the film leaned into hushed, first-person testimonials and grainy nighttime footage that felt uncomfortably close to something you'd stumble across on the news. Audiences in small towns across the South ate it up, and the film became one of the most profitable independent releases of its era, largely on the strength of word of mouth alone. The moment that stuck with an entire generation of kids was simple but effective. A lumbering, hairy silhouette crossing a moonlit field, glimpsed just long enough to convince you it might be real. Sequels and imitators followed for years, but as slicker Hollywood monster movies took over multiplexes, Boggy Creek's homemade charm faded from mainstream memory, surviving today mostly through southern folklore circles and cryptid enthusiasts who still swear something's out there. Speaking of homegrown monsters, our next entry brings the werewolf myth into an unexpectedly wholesome family setting. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf, 1973. By the early 70s, the werewolf myth had mostly become a punchline, showing up in cheap comedies and biker flick spoofs. This film tried to play it straight, taking its cue from Aesop's fable and applying it to a divorced father and his young son on a weekend camping trip gone horribly wrong. After witnessing his dad get attacked by a creature deep in the woods, young Richie watches in horror as his father transforms into a werewolf himself, and spends the rest of the film desperately trying to convince his mother and therapist that the man raising him is now a monster, with predictably tragic results for everyone who doesn't believe him. There's a genuinely poignant idea buried in here, using a divorced kid's fear of losing his father as the emotional engine of a monster movie, and the film's small-town, made-for-TV atmosphere gives it an oddly earnest, sincere quality that a lot of glossier werewolf films of the era lacked. It even features a bizarre detour involving a group of guitar-strumming Jesus-freak hippies who wander into the plot, adding a strange time capsule flavor to the whole production. Unfortunately, the werewolf makeup became an instant liability rather than an asset, with the transformed creature looking far closer to a disgruntled house pet than anything remotely threatening, undercutting nearly every scare the film was reaching for. It quietly disappeared into television reruns and bargain bin video releases for decades, only recently rediscovered by genre completionists hunting down forgotten 70s horror curiosities. From family drama gone lycanthropic, our next stop trades werewolves for something considerably more otherworldly. Equinox 1970, long before The Evil Dead made cursed books and cabin-in-the-woods horror a genre staple, a group of amateur effects artists working on essentially no budget beat it to the punch by over a decade. Equinox follows four young friends who head into the California canyons for a picnic visit to their old college professor, only to find his cabin destroyed and the man himself missing. In the wreckage, they discover an ancient book bound with occult secrets, and their meddling with it accidentally unleashes a demon named Asmodeus, along with an army of increasingly bizarre creatures determined to reclaim it. What makes Equinox a genuine landmark, rather than just another forgotten drive-in curiosity, is who was behind the camera. The film began as a backyard passion project between friends, several of whom went on to become legendary names in visual effects, including a young stop-motion animator who would later win multiple Oscars working on Star Wars and other blockbuster franchises. Watching the film today, you can see those talents forming in real time, particularly in a genuinely impressive stop-motion giant brought to life through forced perspective trickery that still holds up as a clever practical effects achievement decades later. Everything surrounding those effects sequences is far rougher. The dialogue is stiff and occasionally unintentionally funny. The performances are amateur across the board, and the pacing outside the monster set pieces drags considerably. Rediscovered decades later and eventually preserved by film historians who recognized its influence, Equinox has since been credited as a direct inspiration for the cursed book horror subgenre that would flourish years afterward. From homemade demons summoned by amateurs, we're heading into a far more infamous production, one built entirely around one legendary actress's final screen role. Trog 1970. From homemade demons summoned by amateurs, we're heading into a far more infamous production, one built entirely around the final screen appearance of one of Hollywood's biggest legends. Trog opens with a group of spelunkers exploring an uncharted English cave, only to be attacked by a savage, ape-like creature living in its depths. The sole survivor leads anthropologist Dr. Brockton to the discovery of a lifetime. A living troglodyte, a missing evolutionary link between ape and man, whom she brought back to her research institute in hopes of studying and even domesticating him. The reason this film has endured in cult memory has almost nothing to do with the creature, and almost everything to do with its star. This was the final theatrical role of Joan Crawford, a 5-decade Hollywood icon closing out her legendary career playing scenes opposite a stuntman in a shaggy ape-man costume, throwing him a ball in the yard and treating him with the doting affection of a pet rather than a prehistoric threat. That jarring disconnect between old Hollywood glamour and low-budget monster movie silliness has become the film's entire legacy, generating a strange, watchable fascination that outlasts any of its scares. Everything else in the film struggles to keep pace with that novelty. The courtroom drama stretched debating science versus superstition drags considerably. The creature's eventual rampage feels tacked on and rushed, and the film's second half largely abandons whatever thoughtful ideas it flirted with early on. Trog closes out an already strange career on a genuinely bizarre note, remembered today less as a monster movie and more as an unintentional piece of Hollywood mythology. From Hollywood's biggest star fighting a caveman, we're heading into Spanish horror's most beloved werewolf legend next. The Werewolf vs. the Vampire Woman 1971. From Hollywood's biggest star fighting a caveman, we're heading into Spanish horror's most beloved franchise. and the film widely credited with kickstarting an entire nation's horror boom. The Werewolf vs. the Vampire Woman follows two French students, Elvira and Genevieve, traveling the countryside in search of the lost tomb of Countess Wandessa, a medieval noblewoman rumored to have been a vampire. Their search leads them to the castle of Waldemar Daninsky, a brooding aristocrat harboring a curse of his own. And when Elvira accidentally revives the Countess from her tomb, the film spirals into a gothic showdown between the resurrected vampire and Daninsky's tortured werewolf alter ego. This was actor Paul Naschy's fifth outing as Daninsky, a character he'd play across more than a dozen films over the following decades, and this entry is widely considered one of the strongest in the entire series. Much of that comes down to atmosphere, with director Leon Klimovsky drenching the vampire sequences in hazy slow motion that gives the film a genuinely dreamlike, otherworldly quality unusual for the era's low-budget horror. Naschy himself brings real physical and emotional weight to Daninsky, playing the werewolf less as a mindless monster and more as a man cursed and desperate for release, which gives the film's gothic excess an unexpectedly sympathetic core. Where the film stumbles is in its title promise. The long-awaited confrontation between werewolf and vampire arrives disappointingly rushed, with little of the build-up or rivalry the premise seems to demand. Still, its lush atmosphere and Naschy's committed performance helped ignite a wave of Spanish horror productions that followed, cementing this film's reputation as a genre landmark. Speaking of Daninsky's cursed legacy, our next entry continues his story in a considerably grimmer direction. Curse of the Devil, 1973. Speaking of Daninsky's cursed legacy, this entry continues his story in a considerably grimmer direction, opening centuries earlier than any prior film in the series. An inquisitor named Irenaeus Daninsky burns a witch, Countess Bathory, at the stake for sorcery, and with her dying breath, she curses his entire bloodline. 400 years later, his descendant Waldemar Daninsky accidentally shoots and kills a gypsy man, while out hunting, prompting the man's grieving family to summon Satan himself for revenge, setting the ancient curse into motion and transforming Waldemar into a werewolf. This was the seventh entry in actor Paul Naschy's long-running werewolf saga, and notably the film that completely reboots the character's origin story rather than building on the 6 films that preceded it, giving newcomers an easier entry point into the mythology. It's also considered one of the series' bloodiest and most atmospheric installments, with the countryside village setting and gothic castle interiors given genuine visual polish, and Naschy delivering one of his more commanding, brooding performances as a man tormented by a curse he never asked for. The transformation sequences, while achieved through the same basic layered makeup techniques Universal pioneered decades earlier, still land with a striking feral intensity. Where the film loses momentum is pacing, with some critics noting the romantic subplot between Waldemar and a young village woman slows the film's momentum in its middle stretch, and the storytelling leans on familiar werewolf movie beats without adding much new to the formula. Still, for Naschy fans, this remains one of the more visually accomplished and emotionally grounded entries in his sprawling werewolf filmography. From cursed bloodlines, we're heading into a film whose title alone promises pure, unfiltered monster movie chaos. Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks, 1974. From cursed bloodlines, we're closing out this countdown with a film whose title alone promises exactly the kind of unfiltered monster movie chaos it delivers. Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks follows Count Frankenstein, who acquires the body of a Neanderthal man beaten to death by an angry village mob and brings him back to life in his castle laboratory, creating a hulking, dim-witted creature the Count keeps hidden away alongside a household of genuinely bizarre helpers, including a scheming dwarf assistant with a taste for necrophilia and a mute strongman servant. When a second wild Neanderthal wanders into the story, and the dwarf assistant, expelled from the castle after his behavior grows too depraved even for this household, seeks revenge, the film builds toward an absurd showdown between the two brutish creatures. This Italian production has become a beloved curiosity among European exploitation fans almost entirely because of how unapologetically it embraces trash cinema excess. The cast includes genuinely notable names slumming it in gloriously campy territory, and the film piles on gratuitous nudity, cheap gore effects, and perverse character quirks with a shameless enthusiasm that makes it feel less like a serious monster movie and more like a checklist of every sleazy exploitation trope of the era crammed into one castle. Even the film's basic production history is famously murky, with historians still disputing who actually directed it decades later. Judged as a coherent horror film, it barely holds together, with a threadbare plot that exists mainly to connect its most outrageous moments. But as pure, campy Eurotrash spectacle, capped off by an absurd monster versus monster brawl, Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks earns its place as one of the strangest, most entertainingly unhinged relics of 70s genre cinema. Prophecy 1979. From Eurotrash monster brawls, we're closing out this list with something considerably bigger in scale, a studio-backed nightmare almost nobody remembers exists. Prophecy sends an EPA researcher, Dr. Robert Verne, and his wife Maggie into the Maine wilderness to mediate a dispute between a logging company and a local Native American tribe, who insist the mill's paper waste is poisoning the water supply. As mutated wildlife begins turning up throughout the forest, the couple's investigation leads them to Katahdin, a massive, grotesquely deformed bear driven to violent rage by years of mercury contamination and now hunting anyone who ventures too deep into its poisoned territory. What makes Prophecy such a fascinating oddity is the pedigree behind it. This was directed by John Frankenheimer, the acclaimed filmmaker behind The Manchurian Candidate, backed by a major studio and a genuine budget, giving it a level of polish and scenic grandeur most films on this list could never dream of. There's real ambition in its environmental message, using the mutant bear as a none-too-subtle metaphor for corporate negligence and industrial pollution, and Frankenheimer brings a surprising amount of gravity and tension to sequences of characters fleeing through the wilderness. A young Talia Shire anchors the film with genuine emotional weight, particularly in scenes involving the creature's mutated cub. Where the film stumbles is in its central monster, which, despite the talent and money behind the production, ended up looking more grotesquely goofy than genuinely terrifying once fully revealed on screen. Undercutting much of the tension the film spends its runtime building, Prophecy remains a genuinely strange artifact, proof that even studio money and directorial pedigree couldn't guarantee a monster movie's central creature would actually work, closing out this countdown as its biggest, most ambitious, and most unintentionally silly entry. These films rarely got their due on first release, drifting into obscurity through late-night television reruns and bargain video bins, but decades later, cult audiences have kept them alive, but precisely because nothing else looks or feels quite like them. Whether you're a long-time creature feature historian or just discovering some of these titles for the first time, hopefully this list gave you a few strange new gems worth hunting down. So let us know in the comments which of these forgotten monsters deserves more recognition, and what corner of retro creature feature horror should we dig into next. If you enjoyed unearthing these buried curiosities with us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there's plenty more forgotten monster history where this came from. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.